Okay, so I think we're good with the audio.
So far seems like it, so I think we're good to go.
All right, great. So I'm very happy to be here today, and my name is John James. I'm joined here by my colleague Marek Pikna, and we're both working with company Code Now, based here in Prague in the Czech Republic. And for today, we have quite an interesting, if I do say so myself, we have quite an interesting presentation to share with you, nice and concise, only half an hour. And we're going to be talking about your developers already use AI more than you think. So rather topical.
Just one thing to add here, in case you have any questions, there will be room for Q&A. So feel free to write the questions into the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the session.
Absolutely. Okay. So I think we can basically begin. In today's session that Marek and I will be sharing with you, we're going to be looking around a very simple but increasingly important observation. In many organizations, AI adoption inside the software delivery area is already at a far more advanced stage than leadership teams actually realize. For this specific presentation today, we're going to be focusing on AI usage specifically by developers. So I think it's fair to say that when executives think about AI, they often imagine formal transformation initiatives, steering committees, approved pilots, innovation programs, but the operational reality inside engineering teams is often extremely different. Developers are obviously using AI systems every day. Coding, debugging, documentation, architecture suggestions, and so on. In many organizations, this is already deeply embedded into the daily workflows. So the question here is not, will AI enter into software delivery? That's already happened. The real question is actually whether organizations are governing this transition deliberately or whether it is happening invisibly beneath the surface. Perhaps at this point, a useful thought experiment could be, if I asked your CTO today, what is your cost per user story? In most organizations, the answer is that I think they don't really know. So do we know how many tokens have been used in our processes and how has this driven the costs up? AI is becoming operationally important while remaining rather operationally invisible. So, we need to be careful in terms of how we're measuring things. If we're measuring in terms of, let's say, man days worked, which was popular in the past, we could actually be missing a massive hidden cost in terms of the tokens used. Let me try and change the slide. Okay. So, moving on, I think we can then say that, I actually like this terminology here, shadow AI is the new shadow IT. So I would expect that many of you remember the rise of shadow IT during the early cloud era. And this was when business units and employees began adopting cloud tools faster than the governance structures could adapt, similar to today. By the time leadership reacted, usage was already deeply embedded operationally. Something is very similar happening just now with AI, or at least that's how it appears to me. Developers naturally optimize for productivity. If a tool helps them solve problems faster, reduce repetitive work, improve delivery speed, then it's understandable that adoption tends to happen organically. The challenge here is that this adoption often occurs rather informally, outside of centralized visibility, policy frameworks, procurement processes, or even, and importantly, security oversight. And importantly, I should point out here, just to be clear, this is not malicious behavior. Most developers are simply trying to work more effectively. But operationally, it creates an extremely bothersome, if I can say, governance challenge that many organizations are only beginning to recognize. I have spoken to organizations where management believed AI usage was limited to small pilot groups. And 6 weeks later, they discover the developers were using 3 different coding copilots, 2 external LLM APIs, and several browser-based AI tools. You know, nobody had actually hidden anything. Nothing was being, you know, put away from view. Nobody had broken policy. The organization simply had no mechanism to see what was already there. Yeah. Let's look at the next slide. And why would this be? Why do the developers adopt AI so quickly? Well, of course, AI adoption is accelerating so rapidly because the productivity impact is often immediate and tangible. I think all of us have had this experience in our day-to-day lives. Sometimes just using ChatGPT can give such a wonderful productivity boost. You can do a task which would have taken you hours, and it can be done in a few minutes. So the developers can use AI to accelerate coding, automate documentation, generate tests, all sorts of different activities that were very time-consuming in the past. And this value, this productivity gain, is basically immediately visible. So it generates, if I can say, a very powerful adoption dynamic. If one developer becomes materially faster using AI-assisted workflows, then others are quickly going to notice. You know, developers are usually friends with developers. They will tell their friends. Teams begin experimenting. Practices spread informally and very quickly. And this creates an important leadership challenge. The incentives for adoption are extremely, extremely strong at the operational level, even when the governance maturity is still developing at the organizational level too. So, you know, historically, if you wanted a developer to change behavior, to change the way they do things, you needed training, process changes, management sponsorship, perhaps even organizational redesign. It was very slow. This took a while. AI is unusual because the incentive is immediate. A developer can ask a question and save 30 minutes within the next 30 seconds. That is an extraordinarily powerful adoption mechanism. Let me give you a numerical example. Now imagine if you had a 100 developer organization where every developer saves just 30 minutes per day through AI assistance. That's entirely believable, extremely possible. That's 50 hours per day of additional engineering capacity. Over a year, that's thousands of hours of productive output appearing inside the organization almost overnight. In terms of the opportunity cost, this is absolutely phenomenal. Let me change the slide here. But that draws us to the next point, which I would call the leadership blind spot. You know, when you speak directly with the engineering teams, they know what they're doing and they're getting ahead with it. A lot of the leadership, they are still considering the tools to use, the procurement processes, how to set things up, how to install things, how to go through the pilot process. It's much, much slower than the reality on the ground. The longer that gap exists, the harder governance becomes later. You know, recently, one executive told me, we're still assessing AI. Yet, when we looked more closely at what they were doing, their engineers are already using AI-generated code in production systems. The assessment phase there had effectively been bypassed by operational reality quite some time ago. The organization was discussing adoption, while adoption had already basically happened and continued to be happening. And this brings us to the hidden risks of unmanaged AI usage. Now, not to be alarmist, and in no way, of course, as Code Now, we are not anti-AI. And of course, the AI creates the wonderful opportunities. However, this unmanaged adoption can introduce significant operational exposure. For example, many companies are going to face questions around sensitive data exposure, inconsistent use of external APIs, lack of auditability, unclear ownership of AI-generated outputs. Okay, so who cares? You know, that sounds like potential risks. Maybe we can just wing it and get on with it and we'll be fine. Well, no, let's imagine worst case scenarios. How could this go horribly wrong? Well, you could face massive GDPR fines, for example. GDPR, that's already many years already established, and a lot of companies, and very reputable companies, they have been fined and they will be fined. You know, your software itself could crash, the website goes down. You might discover you don't actually own your IP. You're not even sure what is in your IP. So if you were looking at getting investment into your company, or someone was going to buy you out, you might discover that your main asset, you don't actually have it. So that could be rather detrimental. And let's not even imagine what could happen with rogue AI agents and the damage that they could then potentially bring. So this is a very important issue regarding the governance visibility. If leadership cannot clearly see which systems are currently being used, where the data is flowing, then operational risk becomes difficult to manage strategically, perhaps even impossible. And, you know, the biggest risk here, like I mentioned, it isn't about data leakage. It's about inconsistency. If you have 3 different teams using 3 different sets of tools with AI systems in there, and at the end of the period, you end up with an enterprise architecture that reflects opinions of multiple AI models rather than any kind of intentional design or decisions by the organization. And I think if you have any friends who are developers, you might discover that they would already be telling you now in 2026, they're spending less and less of their time in writing code and spending much more time in reviewing code generated by AI than writing it themselves. So already, it doesn't matter if we're disturbed by this or excited by this. I think it fundamentally already shows, in reality, the very nature of software delivery is already changed, or basically changing in process. So if we consider that, we can see that AI absolutely changes the speed of software delivery without any doubt at all. One of the most, if I can say, one of the most important dynamics happening right now is this acceleration, the very acceleration itself. The governance frameworks inside the enterprises, and I think perhaps I labor the point, they evolve relatively slowly. Features can be developed faster now, infrastructure can be configured faster, automation can scale faster. The governance structures, you know, the approval processes, the security reviews, compliance frameworks, they still move at a traditional enterprise speed. This mismatch creates tension, or in fact, this mismatch can potentially, as we've discussed, be disastrous, catastrophic. The challenge isn't now about how can we accelerate delivery. The challenge is how do we accelerate delivery without losing operational control. And I think, you know, this changes, this inverts a question that's been around for the last 20 years. It's no longer about how do we get developers to work faster, to do their jobs faster. The question is, even or especially if the developers are working faster, how do we, in time, create these governance mechanisms around them? So I think the good news is we probably have an idea of what needs to be done in this regard. And we've come to the conclusion that the future is something which I would call a human-AI hybrid engineering approach. There's so much discussion at the current time about fully autonomous AI-driven software delivery. That's questionable how wise that would be, even if you could get it. In practice, we still need, and companies still need, the accountability, oversight, judgment, and trust that comes on the human side. And I think this isn't going to go away anytime soon. We therefore think, I do strongly think for myself, that the solution here is human AI hybrid operating models, which means the AI accelerates your execution, your automation, productivity. That's wonderful, that's fantastic. But the role still remains for experienced engineers, that they're going to be dealing with the side of governance, validation, contextual understanding, and strategic oversight. So in many ways, the more powerful the AI becomes, the more valuable human judgment may become around it. Now, if we extrapolate into the future, without becoming any kind of science fiction scenario, and we don't even need to worry about possible emergence of AGI or not, I think it would be reasonable to predict that, let's say 5 years from now, the most valuable engineers in your team, they are not the people who write the most code. Absolutely not. They might not even be the most highly qualified in terms of the IT qualifications and expertise. Rather, the most valuable engineers are going to be the people who can validate, who can judge, who can govern, who can challenge the AI-generated code at scale. In other words, judgment is going to become more valuable precisely because code generation becomes less scarce. It might even become ubiquitous, commodified. Now, I'm talking a lot here, so I've kind of left my colleague Marek, who's actually a subject matter expert in this regard, a little bit out of the conversation. So I've done the introduction and the background here. I think, Marek, perhaps you could kindly share with the colleagues the practical next steps about what we're going to do and what they can be doing to deal with this situation.
No, certainly. I mean, we kind of established that being able to govern software delivery process in an enterprise level organization is absolutely critical, as suddenly we are more and more getting into the space where we are running into the risks of employee unnecessarily, unfortunately, let's say, sending data into public AI, public LLM, where an AI agent may suddenly discover a vulnerability within own infrastructure, may suddenly decide to, what I've recently seen, for instance, utilize a zero-day vulnerability, or for instance, find out how to get around pseudo privileges and such. All of those things are security nightmares. And there simply needs to be ways how to be able to handle that. So first and foremost, this kind of an idea on how to actually solve this and how to deliver how to enable AI delivery lifecycle in an enterprise level organization. The solution is multi-level. First and foremost, what needs to happen is a certain strategy for AI governance, which is somewhat centralized. It is somewhat centralized, but also slightly distributed. And I'll explain that very quickly. The centralization really specifies these are the tools that we use, and we strive for maximum automation. The automation part there is exactly the decentralization, because currently any governance model which is available essentially assumes that the human person is the slowest part, the delivery is the slowest part. But that's no longer necessarily the case. If an AI agent can deliver a feature, can finish a user story in 30 minutes, well, that's a maximum game changer. So first and foremost, there needs to be a strategy. What that strategy is depends case by case. It is unfortunately impossible to define one specific route. If I may ask for the next slide.
Okay.
But the second portion that's really important and that's somewhat generic in a certain sense is how to actually get there. Not the what do we need, but how do we achieve this? which is the automation aspect, and that comes from internal developer platforms, which in reality are essentially execution engines for software within an enterprise. So an internal developer platform is a platform where engineers are able to develop and deliver their software, push it onto various environments such as test, UAT, prod, wherever, where platform essentially works as the DevOps tool. Now, what that means in reality, or in essence, in practical terms, is really that the platform becomes an execution engine. And now anybody in the company who wishes to develop software does so through the platform. And the platform essentially provides an agent sandbox, an execution engine. And now anybody who delivers, which may be an internal IT team, internal product team, could be non-technical team. A business team such as a risk unit in a bank may decide to develop a script in Python, work with data. Maybe a vendor delivers through one process, or fifth, maybe an AI agent or a team of AI agents. All of them work through the same means, where essentially from the bottom, the platform defines these are your limitations. This is your environment where you work. This is how you work with security. This is how you work with authentication. This is the environment where you have access to. This is how networking works, and so on and so on. And hence, this internal developer platform provides a safe execution engine for basically any user, any customer utilizing it. So that's one strategy, how to be able to achieve this centralized governance. May I answer the next slide?
Mhm.
Perfect, perfect. And as a result, what you actually receive by adopting this kind of a platform approach is not strictly in technical words that you achieve DevOps culture or anything else. From business perspective, you create infrastructure strategy for AI software delivery deployment. Because for AI-ready delivery, not only do you need to automate everything in order to be able to deliver in the first place, but you also need to support this complexity with regards to any kind of security, scalability, and in general, not just software security and like technical security, but information security or anything else. How do you ensure that your AI agent does not promote a version of a dependency to an insecure one and make it impossible for them to obtain it? How do you ensure the AI agents cannot download data from somewhere? It is directly from this execution environment during runtime, creating this operational maturity. So that's all for me, and back to you, JJ.
Okay, so I think we then come to basically what is the strategic question for leadership. Are we actually in reality governing our AI adoption or merely reacting to it? I think a lot of companies are confusing the issues here. They're thinking that we need to jump on the bandwagon for AI adoption. We need to look at the procurement processes for the best tools and instruments, and then we've got to pilot them, and we're measuring them, and then we buy them, and we integrate them into the system. Where, as we've said already, the reality on the ground is that that boat has already sailed, and a lot of the different tools are being used with the accounting risks that these bring, especially if the management doesn't really know what's really going on there. So the companies that probably succeed the most here are not the ones that are going to be using the most tools, but how they can take this approach and be sure that they have the governance systems in process and processes in place to know what's going on, to be able to basically measure it. So what would be the next general steps? We need to have, I would recommend to have, an executive AI governance assessment. Quite simply, we need to see what's really going on in the company, and this is one of the things that CodeNow actually does. We're able to assess the maturity of the governance, the governance maturity itself, AI adoption and visibility, the different workflows, and the overall readiness for the AI era. And this very much differs from company to company. And again, the reality on the ground what's actually happening with the developers and what the leadership teams are seeing are often quite basically miles and miles apart. So if we were going to take 3 points away from today's very brief introductory session, I think on my side, it is fair to say the AI adoption is happening, and it's going to continue to happen. And that change is actually going to probably accelerate. We can see the rate of change over just the last 2 or 3 years, and goodness knows what's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years. So it's happening, and we need to be ready for that. The biggest issue here is not about the technologies, it's about the governance. And those companies that manage to deal with this, not simply the adoption of the technology, but understanding how it is being used, and then the optimal path there to do that operationally and under a government framework, I think those are the ones that are going to succeed. And so in that regard, this is where Code Now can come in. Perhaps maybe Marek, do you have any final thoughts apart from my 3 main takeaways?
What I would really emphasize is that the scalability for any kind of a governance program needs to be embedded directly into any execution, into the runtime. It shouldn't be a topic of, let's say, manual validation and tickets with requests for, can I do this, can I do that? No, it should be set and followed automatically. The more automation, the better.
Okay, that makes sense. So I think that's very good timing on our part. We're about half an hour through.
We are, and there are no questions in the chat. So if anybody has any question, feel free to ask.
Absolutely. So thank you for your time and for your attention. And let's wrap up for today. Thank you very much. Thank you, Marek.
Thank you, JJ.